Jack lived in a small town. He was 35 years old. He worked at a tech company. Every morning he left home at 8 a.m. He wore the same blue jacket every day. His life was quiet. His life was simple. Jack did not own a car. He rented one from an old lady. Her name was Mrs. Green. Her house was on the same street as his. The car was a small white sedan. It was old, but it ran well. Jack liked it. He called it Snow. Every weekend, Jack washed the car himself. He played music while he worked. Sometimes he sang. His voice was soft. Neighbors watched and smiled. One Saturday, Mrs. Green came out with lemonade. "You work harder than I do," she laughed. Jack smiled. "It's a good car," he said. "You are a good man," she told him. "Steady and kind." Jack always paid the rent on time. It was not much, just enough. Mrs. Green trusted him. He was quiet, polite, and never late. They did not talk much, but when they did, it was always warm. Jack liked his job too. He sat in an office with 4 people. He answered emails and fixed problems. He didn't love it, but it was fine. At lunch, he walked to the park. He sat on the same bench. He ate the same sandwich. One day he saw a squirrel steal his cookie. He laughed out loud. A real full laugh. It felt good. Life was not perfect, but it was okay. He didn't need more. A simple life is not a small life, he often said to himself. He believed it. Jack didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. It was Monday. The sky was grey. Jack sat at his desk. His computer made a soft beep. He looked at the screen. There was a new email. Subject: Company update. Jack opened it. He read the first line. "We are sorry to inform you." He froze. He read it again. His hands felt cold. "We no longer need your position. Your last day is Friday." He could not move. The office was quiet. Someone coughed. A phone rang, but Jack heard nothing. He stood up slowly. He walked outside. The air felt heavy. The wind was sharp. He sat on a bench, the same bench from lunch breaks. He looked at the ground. A dry leaf blew past his foot. "What now?" he whispered. "What do I do now?" That night, Jack didn't eat. He lay on his bed, eyes open. The ceiling looked like a blank page. No job, no money, no plan. The next day, he went to Mrs. Green's house. He held his hat in his hands. "Good morning, Jack," she said. He nodded. "I lost my job," he said. His voice was quiet. "I need more time to pay this month." Mrs. Green looked at him. She didn't smile. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, "but I must raise the rent." Jack blinked. "What?" "Times are hard," she said. "My bills are high." Jack looked at the car. It sat in the driveway, clean and still. "I understand," he said, but his heart felt heavy. He walked home slowly. Each step felt harder than the last. That night he wrote in his notebook, "When it rains, it pours. But you can still hold an umbrella." Then he closed the book and turned off the light. Jack woke up early. He sat at his desk. He opened his laptop. He looked for jobs. He sent 10 emails. He got no replies. He called 2 companies. They said, "We're not hiring." He sighed. Every day felt the same. Wake up, apply, wait, eat a little, sleep a little, worry a lot. The car stayed in the driveway. He didn't drive it anymore. He wanted to save gas. He walked to the store. He walked to the post office. One afternoon his phone buzzed. It was a message from Mrs. Green. "Rent is late. I need the car back." Jack stood still. He stared at the screen. His chest felt tight. He walked outside. The sun was low. The light was gold. He looked at the car. He touched the hood. The metal was warm. He remembered trips to the lake. He remembered singing with the window down. He remembered silence on rainy nights. He closed his eyes. He whispered, Thank you, Snow. He got the keys. He walked to Mrs. Green's house. She didn't answer the door, so he put the keys in the mailbox. Then he turned around and walked home. When he got inside, he sat on the floor. He didn't cry, but he felt like something inside him was falling apart, slowly, like a quiet storm. That night he wrote in his notebook, "Sometimes we let go not because we want to, but because we have to." He closed the book. He looked at the window. A single star blinked in the sky. He whispered, "I just need one more chance." Jack was tired, but he still woke up early. He still got dressed. He still looked for work. One morning he heard a knock at the door. It was his neighbor Lisa. She held 2 big boxes. "Can you help me carry these?" she asked. Jack nodded. Of course. He followed her down the stairs. The boxes were heavy, but he didn't mind. When they reached her car, she smiled. "You're strong," she said. Jack smiled back. "Not really, just trying." Lisa owned a bakery. It was small but busy. She made fresh bread and cakes every day. "You good with people?" she asked. Jack shrugged. "I think so." Lisa looked at him. "Want a part-time job?" Jack blinked. "Really?" She nodded. "Just deliveries. A few hours a day." Jack smiled. A real smile. "Okay," he said. "I'd like that." The next day Jack started work. He wore an apron and a cap. He put cakes in boxes and took them to customers. He knocked on doors. He said, "Hello, your cake is here." People smiled. Some gave him tips. One kid gave him a high five. Jack laughed for the first time in weeks. At night he was tired, but not empty. He wrote in his notebook, "You can start small and still move forward." One Friday, Lisa handed him a pink box. "Deliver this to Green Street," she said. Jack looked at the address. It was Mrs. Green's house. He walked there slowly. The trees looked greener today. The air was warm. He knocked on the door. Mrs. Green opened it. She was surprised. "Jack," she said. "This cake is for you," Jack said. "It's from the bakery." Mrs. Green held the box in her hands. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she smiled, just a little. "Thank you," she said softly. Jack nodded. "You're welcome." Then he turned and walked away, the sun behind him. Mrs. Green closed the door. She looked at the pink box. She opened it slowly. Inside was a small lemon cake. There was a card. "Baked with care, Lisa's Bakery." She sat down at the kitchen table. She took a bite. It was sweet, soft and warm. Just like something she hadn't felt in a while. She looked out the window. The car was gone. The driveway was empty. But her heart felt full. The next day she walked to the bakery. The bell rang as she opened the door. Jack stood behind the counter. He looked up. He smiled. "Hi, Mrs. Green." She walked over slowly. "I didn't know you worked here," she said. Jack laughed. "Just started. Delivering cakes." Mrs. Green looked at him for a moment. "You doing okay?" she asked. Jack nodded. "One day at a time," he said. "I'm not where I used to be, but I think I'm moving forward." She touched the counter gently. "I'm sorry," she said, "for raising the rent, for not listening." Jack shook his head. "It's okay. Life is hard for everyone." He smiled gently. "We all have our storms." They stood in silence for a moment. It was not heavy. It was quiet and kind. "Would you like a coffee?" Jack asked. Mrs. Green smiled. "I'd love one." They sat by the window. Outside, the sky was clear. Inside, 2 people shared a warm drink. No past, no rent, no car. Just now. Just this. "We all carry something," Jack said. "Let's carry it together."